Hi everyone. I'm so glad to see that we have many here joining us for this closing session panel. And I'm also glad to have three good friends and great scholars with us. We have Andres Luque from Colombia. He's a postdoctoral research associate at Durham University. We also have Gordon McGranahan, a guy I admire for his work. He's a principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And Susan Parnell, last but not least, Susan Parnell, another person whose work I really enjoy reading. She's an urban geographer at the University of Cape Town. So, what is what we want to do in this closing session? We really want to take stock and look forward and see where we want to go and wrap up with the idea that UJEC is closing, but we are opening a new time, a new set of opportunities, and we want to be active in developing our vision. So with that spirit, that philosophy in mind, we decided to ask our panelists to share some ideas, thoughts, and to use two questions to organize those. The first is, what are the three key messages you take away from the conference that are crucial for the goal of synthesis? And I really want that you also think about those. Second, if you are to envision an urban initiative beyond UJEC, and this is what we are here about, and we are about to moving into the Future Earth initiative, can you suggest two critical components needed for its design? And here there are two simple questions. What do you have in mind? What flagship activities you have in mind, and how? Because we can have the best of the ideas, but if we don't know, as scientists and researchers, we know, if we don't design mechanisms to move forward, then we'll go, I don't know, nowhere. So without further talking, I would like to ask Andres to get us started, and I will give him 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. It's quite daunting to think about summary messages in a conference that has been so rich, but throughout these 3 days there's been a key idea, one idea that I'm going to try to look at from 3 different perspectives, and it's a very powerful recognition of the political nature of the interface between urbanization and global environmental change. And really what this is telling us, what I saw, is that the challenges that are brought about by urbanization and global environmental change are challenges that should not be looked at only from a technical perspective, but also from a political perspective. So what do we mean by political here? Exactly what are we talking about? So I thought it would be interesting to go back to a basic definition of politics as a practice and theory of influencing other people, particularly at a civic level, as a discussion around collective priorities, around managing collective affairs, a discussion around rights and responsibility, and around power and the distribution of resources, and most importantly, a discussion around the urban, the future of the city. I would like to remind us the Greek notion of the polis, which is precisely what brings us here together, the urban. Therefore, the political is the space from where we can imagine and put in place a different collective future. So, where did I see politics in the past 3 days? Well, all the way from Alejandro Nadal's call to consider macroeconomics and issues of political economy in our environmental practice, Karen Sito's call to consider history in the way in which scientific and analytical frameworks operate, and for that, I would add that for me, a recognition of history is a recognition that the present condition is the result of historical processes, many of which have been characterized by relationships of power and domination, or Federico's presentation on smart cities, where he invites us not only to think and to explore the benefits and technologies of digital urbanization, but also to think critically about the promises of the smart city. Or John Robinson's excellent presentation on the interface between science, sustainability, and policy, where he calls for a science that feeds social mobilization, social movements, social innovation as a productive way of impacting policy. Or Michael Sau's presentation around the environmental history of Taipei, where he points to how historically decisions in favor of growth affected both the environment as well as the quality of life of populations. And in his words, he asked us to be not too romantic of the so-called sustainable development future. So it was very clear that in the plenary sessions, the idea of the political was there present. But this was beyond the plenaries. It was also an idea that was present in the panel sessions as well as in the discussions. We heard from colleagues living in or working in India, Indonesia, and Vietnam, mentioning the challenges of a development model that is based on consumption, a challenge that becomes more evident in the context of growing middle classes. We heard from colleagues from Chile, talking about the challenges brought about by an early phase of privatization of environmental resources, water in this case, where municipalities can buy back local water rights in order to provide water to their citizens because it's too expensive. A challenge that will be exacerbated by a changing climate in the context of resource constraints. We heard from colleagues from Mexico who pointed to the impact that diverting water flows towards an ever-growing Mexico City has had on rural communities and the political resistance that indigenous communities have developed in this context. We heard from colleagues in Zambia working on sanitation and water quality in informal urban settlements who pointed us to the extent by which tenure security, the ownership of the land where they live, is a key element of urban adaptation processes. So it was a very rich political debate that was happening. And the key question is, what does this mean for us? Well, what does it mean for an academic community that is here gathered to think about urbanization and global environmental change? I would believe that it means finding tools that enables us to engage with these discourses, with these discoveries, with these debates. Tools that enables us to contribute not only to policy, but also to broader political debates. Tools that allows us to reinvent collective futures. It means embracing a language that allows us to discuss these issues, both from a natural science perspective as well as from a social science perspective. It means to critically examine the role of markets, think about structural conditions, think about the role of the state, think about forms of ownership. It means, above all, understanding that ecological flows are not only resource flows, but also flows of power. And it means finding new epistemological and ontological entry points to understand the relationship between urbanization and global environmental change. And by that, I mean new ways of knowing, as well as new ways of conceptualizing the nature of beings, the nature of nature. So I want to finish by pointing to a few very practical ways in which we can move in this direction. First, the need to engage more with the need and value of engaging more with academics that are working on critical social science around the interface between the urban and the environment, or the urban or the environment. And particularly, I think that it will be very useful to continue engaging to bring more urban political ecologists, but also new ways of understanding the urban that are emerging within academia, very much informed by post-structuralist thinking. And I'm talking about things like assemblage urbanism, cosmopolitan urbanism, subaltern urbanism, etc. Second, I think we need to consider the role of capital flows and the environmental implications of finance-led economic systems. For example, I'm talking about the possible carbon lock-ins that could emerge out of the financialization of urban infrastructures. I'm talking about the high or the low carbon pathways that are crafted through specific financial technologies or economic rationalities. And also how the geographies of money and finance could stand on the way of increasing adaptive capacity in cities. And finally, I think that we should examine the tensions between modes of production, forms of consumption, and the environment. Something that is particularly relevant in the context of rapidly growing urban middle classes in Asia and Africa, but certainly not exclusive. Something that is also very important for Latin America, for Australia, and for the global north. And through these analyses, contribute to a challenge to a reimagination of dominant development modes.
There's a certain symmetry for me in sitting here, because I'm not even sure if the people on the science committee of UJIC will recall that I was actually one of the reviewers for the original science plan. And I have returned to that document on a number of occasions, and I think others have remarked in this conference on the ongoing utility of that original conception. And so I just wanted to start off, in a sense, with in part a degree of congratulations. I think the intellectual leadership of the team of the science committee that was both had the foresight to define a domain of work and to lay out an intellectual foundation that has served exceptionally well over a really quite extended time and really critical time in the life of this issue in the both policy and scientific debate. So, colleagues, congratulations. And I think it's particularly useful and in the spirit of the kind of thoughtfulness of both the intellectual and the political and the policy agenda that we are here to look at the question of synthesis. And that is the question that we've been asked to look at here. I want to pick up on a part of a response to that, and hopefully you're reading right across us, because we did caucus a little bit. Whether we stick to our pitch, of course, is a different story of kind of the politics, the science, and in some senses the policy kinds of questions. But it does seem to me one of the things I have heard is an undercurrent sometimes and an overt articulation at others that there is a concern about what synthesis means. In other words, is this a synthesis of different science? Is this a synthesis of science and policy? Is this a synthesis that takes us to political action? And clearly it's all of those, but they are very different kinds of synthetic activities, and we need to be clear about what those are. And I want to speak in the first instance to the difficulty of the synthesis of science. Because it does seem to me that there are some very real questions that face future Earth on this issue as we begin to look at the question of the future urban or the urban future. The first thing it seems to me, and I spoke a little earlier about the difficulty of the commitment to co-production. And I just want to reiterate and say again that I think that the commitment to co-production in our science needs to extend and enrich, not to violate and compromise established methods and ethics of science. In other words, we've heard very little about those words, methods and ethics. And perhaps we need to reinsert those into our discussion. In other words, we need to ensure both intellectual and normative integrity in the focus of our research calls, in the focus of the funding, whether that's for solo or for group work, and also in the processes of evaluation. We can't compromise. Having said that, what we're not doing well enough, fast enough, and with sufficient reach. So we've got to go back at the same time and push ourselves. And that raises, for me, some questions about what kinds of extra science do we need, or different science do we need before the act of synthesis. And there are points which have come out of a number of the different sessions, and I'm not saying anything which others in the room have not said in other ways. I think the first is that we need to cover multiple scales, unambiguously. We need to have information at the local, at the meso, at the global, and we need the understanding of the interface of those scales. We've heard the point, and you made it again, about the importance of the temporality of the work that we do. At what point have environmental systems changed? When has tipping point been reached? Will it be reached? When were institutions put in place that created and built resilience, and when were the important gaps in the establishment of those systems? I think we have to ask some questions about whether we've got the right balance in the disciplines. In other words, we've had a delightful mix of ecologists, climate scientists, not that many hydrologists, very few economists, and we really need to begin to ask whether not only do we have the right people in the room, but have we given the right amount of airtime to the different people in the room as we begin that intervention of synthesis in that way. And that's not the same question as the interdisciplinary question. We're going to have to face the interdisciplinary question, but I think before we even do that, we have to ask whether the foundations of the knowledge that we have are adequately represented. Because before we begin to start looking at how there's a synthetic understanding of global environmental change at the urban scale, whether we actually understand the entire system. And I'm not 100% convinced that we're there yet. Which leads me to the question of what really should new science begin to start focusing on as we fill the gaps and as we move, in a sense, to that next phase. It does seem to me that one of the things we've got to be very alert to is not just the thematic and issue-based gaps, but also the geographical gaps in our knowledge. And that's not just about the point I made earlier about Africa, but it is unambiguously the point about Africa. You cannot begin to create a global synthesis when you have major omissions in your understanding of processes. But it's as true of small towns. Much of what we focused on here has been very metropolitan in focus. So, those linkages, those synergies come from understanding across methods, across time, across location, across very political contexts, and if we are going to look for key entry points, whether they are intellectual or political, we need to be very, very clear that we have been robust in our synthesis. And so, very briefly then, that takes me to what might we think about as we go forward. And I struggled with this because I'm a very kind of linear thinker. I have to kind of stop myself from being A plus B plus C. And it seems to me that there are some foundational questions that we do have to be able to address. Intellectual questions. And this is a good moment. This is a watershed moment, if you like. And it's been coming up, Should we have an urbanization science? Should we talk about planetary urbanism? I think both concepts are deeply problematic in all sorts of ways. Urbanization, not least, because it's that horrible word that in English means at least 3 or 4 different things and 2 very different kinds of communities. I think it's an error linguistically, if not conceptually, to use that term. The urban Anthropocene, deeply problematic in other kinds of ways. However, what I think we do have to realize, and what I think is exciting about the discussion that has been nascent in where we're at, is that there's a recognition and an acceptance that the urban is important. And I think if we're to make the case to the global environmental community that cities are drivers of global environmental change, we have to be able to articulate paradigmatic ways of thinking that people are prepared to follow. And similarly, if we are to get the audience of a much, much, much bigger urban community that is present in this room and present in the wider UJ family, we absolutely have to be able to articulate why you can't understand cities without understanding global environmental dynamics. So that conceptual question does seem to me to be one which must be the outcome of this synergy. The second is a process question, and I'm very pleased that, Thomas, you're sitting in the room. This is for you, so lift it up. Bounce, bounce, bounce. I think that there's a very real question about how we position and how we name and how we organize and how we encourage and how we solicit and how we enroll a community of scholars who will need to include a younger generation of scholars who will take this agenda forward, that is both big enough to include the complexity that we've both talked about so far, and which Gordon's going to talk about again, that is able to cover the science and the policy, but that is also sufficiently of a family that people can actually feel at home, get to know each other, build the kinds of relationships that I think have characterized the last 10 and a bit years of the UJEC work. So I think that's some of the challenge, that process challenge going forward.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do it in terms of three messages. I'm not sure I made the other thing of answering these questions, but I got it to three messages. And the first one relates to what form should the action-oriented research we're thinking of take. And here, in terms of what people said, there wasn't a lot suggesting that we should be creating a sub-discipline. I think there was more suggesting, and it depended on which sessions you went to, but that it could involve the application of systems thinking to urbanization and global environmental change issues. And then the other one that sort of emerged from the way people talking about it does seem to me to be a sort of a community of practice. Well, I didn't look up, but I think that's an anthropologist term about people with there's a sort of having a similar craft and a similar passion, but interacting because they want to rather than they have to, working together and interacting because they want to. And in that case, the obvious area around which the interaction would take place would be potentially problem-based research writ large. And if you think of it in terms of those three, the sub-discipline applications of system thinking to urbanization, global climate change, and community of practice, I suppose I would tend to go for community of practice that could at least potentially be facilitated by systems thinking. So not assuming that that's going to be what binds it together, but taking that possibility seriously and abiding by certain principles that relate to addressing the issues of global environmental change in practice. And that would include, for example, making knowledge that you produce intelligible to someone who actually wants to understand it, which isn't always what research seems to be focused on. The second point relates a little bit to some of the things that Sue was talking about because it's to do with co-production, which came up a few times in the sessions, and I think there was also seemed to be a little bit of confusion about it. So general feeling seemed to be some people thinking it's important, some people thinking it's problematic, maybe it being a bit of both. Is the term helpful? Well, it depends obviously on how it's going to be used. Perhaps not. If we use it without thinking more about it, it seems quite likely to be emptied of meaning in somewhat the same way that resilience is when it becomes too aspirational. I think it's worth thinking a little bit in this context. It didn't come up much about the history of co-production. I'm not really all that familiar with it, but I believe that like all interesting ideas, it really came from the study of cities back in the 60s and 70s, and links to the sort of looking at cities as polycentric systems in terms of their governance. And some of the early examples that came out then a bit later were to do with things like sewers and healthcare and safety, and producing those things where the beneficiaries would be co-producing it with local delivery providers, partly because by having that co-production, the service would end up being delivered better than if it was produced and delivered by two separate institutional entities. And then I think when you think about that in the context of what we're talking about, there is something a little bit problematic about co-producing knowledge. And that if you think about co-producing knowledge with, let's say, governments, there's certain knowledge where you question, and I think there's a danger of forced co-production will produce problems, and I think a number of us will have experienced that type of issue where you end up paying government people to come to meetings, or also, especially when you're dealing with donors and when you're dealing with issues of research in the global south funded by the global north, this sort of co-production can be problematic. And it's doubtful, I think, when it comes to some of the politics that was discussed, that you were discussing, the idea of a political economy that you co-produce with the government, it just doesn't quite sound like the most exciting political economy that anyone's going to ever come up with. But still, that doesn't mean that we can't carefully use co-production as a critical part of the sort of things community practice would engage in. And then the last one I was going to touch on is more my particular take on. I kept on noticing there was this, and I've seen it before, but I hadn't really seen it quite so many times, this distinction which is sort of incremental and transformational. I've had discussed it with a couple of people, but this sort of the idea that what we really want is transformational change, not incremental change, because incremental change is just little bits, and transformational is where you really get the sort of change we want to deal with these big global environmental problems. And I think that it certainly is the case that sometimes we don't know where we want to go, and it's very useful to have a long-term vision of the future, something we want and to, in a sense, transform to. But that often the best means of achieving long-term radical transformation is through incremental change, chosen because it's likely to help achieve a long-term transformation. And that's, in a sense, it goes back to what I got when I was doing that fancy diagram across the thing and got confused because it wasn't quite going the way it was supposed to. But part of the point was that in terms of transformation on the economic side, when you have one of the biggest ones we've seen of this transformation of the more centrally planned economies liberalizing, and Russia in a way went for the Big Bang and didn't get there. And China went for the incremental and experimental with a long-term vision. And in terms of economic growth, boy, did they get there. And so knocking incrementalism seems to me a little bit, you have to be a little bit careful, even though in respect to global environment, there needs to be a bit more transformation.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I open the forum, I really would like to emphasize that we really want to develop a vision, perhaps the wrong, I hope not, the wrong vision, no, the right vision for our urban initiative. I also want to emphasize that a group of us is already working on that, and that your input, your contribution, your initiatives are fundamental. Thomas is there with us, right? We are part of this transition team. We want to engage, and this is a challenge because we want to engage with the global. We want to represent the different initiatives, right? And it's not easy. I mean, building this process takes time, takes effort, and we all are already dealing with our everyday activities. But I really want that you also focus on these two questions in your interventions, and that if we are not able to address all or to share with everyone all our ideas, we should consider this, but one of the opportunities you have to approach us, to engage with us, we also want to engage with you. And without further talking, I would like to see who wants to talk, who wants to participate. I know everyone is tired, but bear with us. Any hand? Or do we need to have to create incentives, right? The one who raises the hand. Go ahead.
I just want to Patricia. I really enjoyed each of your reflections and summary. I'm thinking about how we move forward and what platforms we can use. I'd like to see perhaps kind of a concrete 3 months from now, 6 months from now, maybe we do something as a community that sets us up for larger integration with other communities that are important to bring into the fold. And maybe it's some form of, I think it's a really great representative group we have here. Maybe it's some online 24-hour platform for discussion where we each contribute and envision this urban initiative. Something that keeps the dialogue going. So I'll leave it at that.
Jonathan Barton from Chile. Picking up on something. Hello. Jonathan Barton from Chile. Picking up on something that was mentioned in the morning about the middle class. And if we're expecting 2030, 2050 that we want people to be moving out of poverty, if their consumption patterns are similar to ours, and they want to go to conferences as well, we're in big trouble. So I like the idea of thinking about consumption and high levels of consumption. I think the traditional agenda that we've been working on is about poverty and focusing on looking from the global north to the global south and supporting people. And that's great because it means that people don't have to change their consumption patterns in the global north and in high consumption groups within the global south. And I think that change of focus on looking at high consumption is important, and it fits nicely with the UN 10-year program on sustainable production and consumption. And it changes the focus. It says, hang on, the people who have the resources and the ability and have all this tremendous adaptive capacity should be assuming more responsibility, and the differentiated responsibility principle of Rio can be applied in a very social, into certain social groups rather than across countries, which doesn't make much sense to me.
Something that strikes me is that just now here we talk about culture, power, accumulation, capital accumulation, the middle class. And I really would like to also challenge us to bring the physical science community who, they are reminding us that that we are part of nature, Mother Earth, the Mama Pacha, you name it, and we are interdependent with that, and there is a materiality, not only given by biophysical processes, but also by the material stuff, right, that we hear about by infrastructures, and that we also need to engage with that community. And I say that, as I say when I go to physical scientists, I say, guys, you need more social scientists. So how do we allow that? How do we foster that engagement? I think that will be a challenge for future Earth, but also for us. Someone else? Or are you so tired that you just want to live? I don't know whether you also would like to say something to 1 minute closing remark, because I really sense that everyone is tired.
Not just a technical suggestion, maybe could you put these 2 questions on the website and leave it open for 10 days? And when we recuperate our neurons, they might just kick in. Yeah, that would be a useful way of.
Yes. And there was also the suggestion to have a list of participants that could be rated with Joshua's suggestion, because we need the materiality, right? We need the means for us to continue networking and knowing that there is a big community out there. We know some of its members, but we need to engage with it. So, who wants from? Do you have any comment?
have a thought in very draft form. There was a session on climate justice, which I found really, really interesting. And then out of that session, I kept on asking myself, well, what do we mean by justice that is not political? Why do we talk about climate justice? Could we just get rid of the idea of climate justice and just say, well, climate change is a process that should be discussed politically? And then I went back to the presentations, and in the presentations were discussions about responsibility, about moral responsibility, and I got the feeling that in this idea of climate justice, there is a strong element of beliefs and values, the beliefs and values of those involved. And then I thought about how very often in our scientific practice, we are asked to leave our beliefs and values aside in order to retain a form of scientific legitimacy. And I just wonder, and this is very much in draft, up to which point, as physical scientists, as well as social scientists, we need to bring on board our beliefs and values a little bit more. And I just leave it there as a question. And I mentioned this because we were talking about how to integrate social and physical scientists. And I think that we all share a set of beliefs and values. We just instrumentalize them in different ways. So I wonder up to which point it's important to continue or to bring that a little bit more back to the forefront of our scientific practice.
Yeah, it was a very different tone of comment, but just I wanted to thank people in the room who are specialists, who are here. So whether they're health specialists or energy specialists or biodiversity specialists, many of whom I think reveal an extraordinary sophistication in how they understand the city. And I hope who learned as I did, and I'm none of those things, but who actually learned from others who enter into reading the city from a different kind of register and a different kind of logic, who benefited from the cross-fertilization. Because it seems to me that that's been one of the things which is absolutely essential to this program, and I'm reminded again of how useful it is. And so, as you go away and you reflect, and perhaps are a little frustrated that there wasn't enough hydrology or there definitely wasn't enough economics, but that one also puts that into the positive register of thinking, gosh, when I thought about things from the perspective of, the one that sticks out in my head was the energy session. I see things differently. And so, yeah, thank you for that.
I guess I'll just respond to it's come up a number of times, this issue of dealing with the wealthy and dealing with, not necessarily just dealing with consumption, but how poverty should be somewhat less of a focus. And I guess I have a bit of a concern with that. It seems to me that there's this pendulum that shifts between inequality and poverty as the focus. And it was certainly the case that people needed to say that in the late 90s and the early 2000s when at least in the development arena, poverty was everything had to be framed in terms of addressing poverty, particularly in the UK, but I think more generally. Now inequality is hot, and I sort of feel don't kick poverty when it's down. But I think also people have been saying, my recollection is people have been saying for a long time that they really need to be looked at together, the issues of overconsumption, particularly in wealthy groups in terms of the environmental consequences, but also recognizing that there are problems at the opposite end that are different from the overconsumption ones and that have historically related to things like environmental health, and that there is also a bit of a danger there that the lowest income people always tend to have the old problems that are a bit dull, and they're not involved in the new and emerging problems quite so much, except when you get something like Ebola coming up and then things change. But anyway, that was just I'm trying to bring back the poverty a little bit.
So let's strike a balance and let's work on interdependencies, right? Because wealth is a phase of development, the other is poverty. Before we close this session, I would like to say two things. One is we have all in our urban community is interested in this next phase of what is urban, what of future urban. I just would like to insist that three of us are playing a role. I mean, four. I mean, everyone. But we have David Simon. We have Thomas Elquist, something like that, and me, Patricia Romero-Lankao. We also have Corey and our wonderful office, ASU office, pushing for this change, for this transition. We don't know what will happen with it, but really keep in mind that UJEC is not over. UJEC is changing, is transforming itself, and we want to make sure that we develop a vision, a series of visions that are interconnected as reality is, right? And then I also would like to ask, to close this session and to tell you that there will be a closing remarks session, and I would like Corey to take over. But before I do so, I want to thank our panelists. They really share with us great ideas. They really challenge us, and that's what we want, to challenge and to be challenged. And I want to give them an